Sometimes the most profound love stories begin with the smallest acts of kindness. At 53, Elsbeth thought her days of grand adventures were behind her, that she'd spend her remaining years quietly tending to her village as a healer. But when she found 2 tiny bat pups freezing in the winter forest, her compassionate heart wouldn't let her walk away. She brought them home, warmed them by her fire, and nursed them back to health. What she didn't know was that saving those creatures would bring an ancient vampire lord to her door. Lucien had lived for centuries, but something about this mortal woman stirred feelings he thought were long dead. When he claimed her as his eternal mate under the blood moon, Elsbeth faced an impossible choice. Could a woman who had already lived a full life embrace a love that promised forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ancient oak tree stood sentinel at the forest's edge, its gnarled branches reaching toward the pewter sky like arthritic fingers. Frost clung to every surface in the pre-dawn darkness, turning the world into something crystalline and fragile. It was here, beneath this very tree, that Elsbeth had found them 3 days ago. 2 tiny bat pups, no larger than her thumb, their translucent wings folded against bodies barely warm enough to sustain life. Now, as she walked the familiar path back to her cottage, her worn leather healing satchel bouncing gently against her hip, Elsbeth reflected on how such small creatures could bring such unexpected joy to her carefully ordered world. The satchel, weathered by decades of service, contained everything she needed for her rounds: dried chamomile for the baker's wife's persistent headaches, willow bark for old Henrik's aching joints, and fresh bandages for young Thomas who'd cut his hand on his father's forge. At 53, Elsbeth had settled into the rhythm of her days with the contentment that comes from knowing one's purpose. She rose before dawn, checked on her patients, gathered herbs when the season allowed, and returned each evening to her small cottage, where candlelight danced across hand-sewn curtains, and the fire crackled with familiar warmth. It was a life shaped by service, by the gentle satisfaction of easing others' pain and bringing comfort where she could. Her cottage sat nestled in a grove of birch trees, their white bark gleaming like pale bones in the morning light. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, carrying the scent of burning oak and the herbs she'd hung to dry near the hearth. The building itself was modest, 2 rooms connected by a low doorway, with a root cellar beneath and a small loft above where she stored her medicinal supplies. But it was hers, paid for with 28 years of marriage to Edmund, a kind carpenter, whose steady hands had built much of what made their village home. Edmund had been gone now for 5 years, taken by a fever that even her considerable healing skills couldn't defeat. The grief had been overwhelming at first, a crushing weight that made each breath feel deliberate and difficult. But time had done its work, softening the sharp edges of loss into something more bearable, a gentle melancholy that colored her days without consuming them entirely. The village of Thornwick had accepted her widowhood with the practical kindness that marked small communities. Father Marcus, their priest, checked on her welfare with paternal concern. Gareth the blacksmith brought her iron hooks and tools in exchange for salves that eased the burns he suffered in his daily work. The other widows, Margaret, whose husband had died in a hunting accident, and Agnes, who'd lost hers to the consumption, formed an informal network of mutual support, sharing meals and gossip with equal generosity. It was a good life, Elsbeth often reminded herself. Predictable, useful, peaceful. She had her health, her work, and the respect of her neighbors. What more could a woman of her years reasonably expect? Still, As she pushed open her cottage door and stepped into the warm interior, she couldn't deny the flutter of excitement that came from caring for the two tiny creatures currently sleeping in a nest of soft wool near her hearth. They were unlike anything she'd encountered in her years of healing, their features delicate and almost ethereal, their tiny bodies radiating a warmth that seemed disproportionate to their size. The cottage's main room served multiple purposes. Near the front window stood her work table, where she prepared tinctures and ground herbs with a mortar and pestle Edmund had carved for her as a wedding gift. Shelves lined the walls, holding clay pots filled with dried plants she'd gathered from the forest and fields around Thornwick. Comfrey for wounds, feverfew for women's troubles, elderberry for winter ailments, each carefully labelled and stored according to knowledge passed down from her grandmother and refined through decades of practice. The fireplace dominated the far wall, its hearth wide enough to accommodate both cooking and the warming of her various preparations. Above it hung bundles of lavender, sage and rosemary, their scents mingling with the wood smoke to create an atmosphere of herbal comfort. It was here, in a small basket lined with sheep's wool, that the bat pups had made their temporary home. Elsbeth approached them now with the same gentle care she brought to all her healing work. They were stirring, she noticed, tiny movements that spoke of returning strength. When she'd first found them, they'd been so still she'd feared they were already dead. Only the faintest flutter of breath had convinced her to bring them home, wrapping them carefully in her shawl and holding them close to her body as she hurried through the snow-covered forest. "Good morning, little ones," she whispered, settling into the chair Edmund had built for her beside the fire. The pups responded to her voice, their small heads turning toward the sound. Their eyes, when they opened, were not the black she'd expected, but a deep amber that seemed to hold intelligence far beyond their apparent age. The morning routine had already been established over their few days together. She would warm a mixture of goat's milk and honey over the fire, then use a small cloth to feed them drop by drop. They took the nourishment eagerly, their tiny claws gripping her fingers with surprising strength. There was something almost human in the way they looked at her during these feeding sessions, a connection that went beyond the usual bond between healer and patient. Outside, Thornwick was beginning its daily awakening. She could hear the distant sound of Gareth's hammer against anvil, the lowing of cattle being led to pasture, the chatter of women drawing water from the village well. It was the same symphony of sounds that had marked her mornings for decades. Yet somehow everything felt subtly different now. The presence of the bat pups had introduced an element of mystery into her ordered world, a reminder that life still held the potential for surprise. Father Marcus would not approve, she knew. The village priest viewed anything unusual with suspicion, particularly if it came from the forest that bordered their small community. He preached regularly about the dangers that lurked in the shadows between the trees, warning his flock to stay close to God's light and avoid the temptations of pagan superstition. But Elsbeth had never been one to let fear guide her actions, and these tiny creatures clearly needed her care. The other villagers had begun to whisper. Of course, Mrs. Aldrich had mentioned seeing strange lights in the forest on the night Elsbeth found the pups. Young Timothy claimed to have heard unearthly sounds echoing through the trees. Old Henrik swore the milk in his cellar had soured without cause, though Elsbeth suspected his storage methods were more to blame than any supernatural influence. Such talk was common during the long winter months, when people had little to occupy their minds but gossip and speculation. Elsbeth had learned to let it flow around her like water around a stone, neither engaging with it nor allowing it to disturb her peace of mind. She had work to do, patients to tend, and now 2 small lives depending on her care. As the morning progressed, She went about her usual tasks with the efficient grace of long practice. She checked her stores of dried herbs, noting what would need replenishing come spring. She prepared a new batch of cough syrup for the cooper's youngest daughter, who'd been fighting a persistent chest cold. She mended a tear in her woolen cloak and set bread to rise for the evening meal. But always, her attention returned to the bat pups. They seemed to be growing stronger by the hour, their movements becoming more coordinated and purposeful. By midday, they were attempting to climb from their basket, tiny claws finding purchase on the woven sides. She watched them with a mixture of professional satisfaction and unexpected maternal warmth. It had been many years since anything so small and vulnerable had depended entirely on her care. The afternoon brought visitors, as it often did. Margaret arrived with fresh eggs and news from the village centre. Agnes stopped by with a torn petticoat that needed Elsbeth's skilled needle. Both women noticed the bat pups immediately, their reactions ranging from curiosity to concern. Strange creatures to be about in winter, Agnes observed, keeping her distance from the basket. Don't they usually sleep through the cold months? These are very young, Elsbeth explained, not mentioning how unusual their behavior seemed, even to her experienced eye. They likely haven't learned proper hibernation yet. Margaret, always the practical one, suggested they might carry disease. Forest creatures often do, you know. Perhaps it would be safer to... They're perfectly healthy, Elsbeth assured her firmly, and they'll be returned to the forest as soon as they're strong enough to survive on their own. But even as she said the words, she wondered if they were true. Something about these creatures suggested they were far from ordinary forest dwellers. Their intelligence, their unusual colouring, the way they seemed to respond to her emotional state rather than just her physical presence, all of it spoke to a nature she didn't fully understand. Evening came early in winter, and with it the familiar rituals that marked the end of each day. Elsbeth banked the fire to burn slowly through the night, checked that her doors were securely latched, and said her prayers with the quiet devotion of a woman who had learned to find comfort in routine. The bat pups, now noticeably larger than they'd been that morning, settled into their wool-lined basket with contented squeaking sounds. As she prepared for bed, Elsbeth found herself pausing at the window that faced the forest. The trees stood black against the star-scattered sky, their branches creating intricate patterns of shadow and silver moonlight. Somewhere out there lay the ancient oak where she'd found the pups, where her simple act of compassion had set in motion forces she couldn't yet comprehend. A movement caught her eye, a flicker of darkness against the darkness, too purposeful to be merely wind-stirred branches. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing at the forest's edge, tall and still as the trees themselves. But when she blinked and looked again, there was nothing but shadow and moonlight playing tricks on tired eyes. Still, as she settled into her narrow bed, Elsbeth couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Not with malevolent intent. She'd learned to recognize the weight of dangerous attention during her years of moving through the world as a woman alone. This felt different. Protective, perhaps. Curious. As if something in the darkness was as intrigued by her as she was becoming by the mysteries that had entered her quiet life. The bat pups stirred in their basket as she blew out the last candle, their soft sounds a counterpoint to the settling of the cottage around her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new patients to tend, new questions about the unusual creatures in her care. But tonight, wrapped in the familiar comfort of her small home, Elsbeth allowed herself to drift toward sleep with something she hadn't felt in many years. The anticipation that her carefully ordered world was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine. The second night after finding the bat pups dawned clear and cold, with a stillness that seemed to press against the windows of Elsbeth's cottage like a living thing. She had spent the day tending to her usual rounds, checking on the cooper's daughter whose cough was finally loosening, delivering a poultice for the miller's swollen knee, and gathering what winter herbs she could find beneath the snow. But as evening approached, an unusual restlessness had settled over both her and the tiny creatures in her care. The bat pups, now noticeably larger and more active, seemed unable to find peace in their wool-lined basket. They chittered softly to each other in sounds that almost resembled conversation, their amber eyes bright with an intelligence that continued to unnerve her. Several times throughout the day, she'd caught them watching the windows with an intensity that suggested they were waiting for something. As twilight deepened into true darkness, the atmosphere around Thornwick began to shift in ways that defied explanation. The usual evening sounds, dogs barking, children being called to supper, the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night, gradually faded until an unnatural quiet blanketed the village. Even the wind, which had been stirring the bare branches all day, died away to nothing. Elsbeth noticed the change first as a subtle pressure in her ears, like the feeling that came before a violent storm. She paused in her evening routine of checking her herb stores, one hand resting on a jar of dried lavender as she tilted her head to listen. Nothing. The silence was so complete, it seemed to have weight. Moving to her front window, she peered out at the village beyond her grove of birch trees. Warm light glowed from cottage windows, and she could see the familiar shapes of her neighbors moving about their evening tasks. Yet something felt fundamentally wrong, as if the very air had thickened around them all. Behind her, the bat pups began to make sounds unlike any they'd produced before. Not the soft chittering of contentment or the squeaks of hunger, but something that resembled singing. The notes were too pure, too melodious to come from such tiny throats, yet there was no denying their source. They had climbed to the edge of their basket and were facing the window, their small bodies trembling with what looked like anticipation. The fog came next, rolling out of the forest with unnatural speed and purpose. Elsbeth watched in growing alarm as the grey-white mass flowed between the trees like water, ignoring the usual patterns of wind and terrain. It moved with deliberate intent, seeking out every cottage, every path, every space between buildings, until Thornwick was wrapped in a cocoon of mist so thick she could barely see beyond her own garden. That was when she noticed the glow. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, a reflection of her own candlelight caught in the water droplets of the fog. But as she pressed her face closer to the glass, she realized the pale silver light was coming from outside, specifically from the direction of the ancient oak where she'd found the pups. The light pulsed gently, like a heartbeat made visible, and with each pulse she felt an answering flutter in her chest. It was not fear, exactly, though her rational mind insisted she should be afraid. Instead, it was something closer to recognition, as if some part of her had been waiting her entire life for this moment. The sound of footsteps on the frost-hard ground made her step back from the window. They were too measured to be casual, too confident to belong to anyone lost in the fog. Someone was approaching her cottage with purpose, and somehow she knew this visitor was connected to the strange atmosphere that had settled over the village. A knock came at her door, 3 soft raps that seemed to echo far longer than they should have. The bat pups fell silent, their small bodies rigid with attention. Elsbeth felt her heart rate quicken, but not with panic. Instead, she experienced the same calm that had always settled over her in moments of crisis, the professional composure that had served her well through decades of healing work. She opened the door. The man who stood on her threshold was unlike anyone she had ever seen. Tall and lean, with dark hair that caught the strange silver light emanating from the fog, he possessed the kind of timeless beauty that belonged in illuminated manuscripts rather than standing at the door of a village healer's cottage. His clothes were well made, but not ostentatious, a long coat of fine wool, boots that suggested wealth without flaunting it. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, pale as winter ice, ancient as the oak tree in the forest, and fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Elsbeth," he said, and her name in his voice sounded like music. "I have come for what is mine." She should have been terrified. Every rational part of her mind screamed that this stranger represented danger, that no good could come from a man who appeared out of unnatural fog with claims of ownership. Instead, she found herself studying his face with the same careful attention she gave to diagnosing illness, looking for signs of intent and character. "I don't know what you think belongs to you," she replied steadily, "but you're welcome to come in from the cold while we discuss it." A smile ghosted across his features, not mockery, but something closer to approval. "You are not afraid." Should I be? He considered this with the gravity of someone unaccustomed to being questioned. "Most would be, in your circumstances. Most haven't spent 30 years tending to whatever and whoever needs care," Elsbeth said. "I've learned that fear rarely helps anyone heal. And yet you know, don't you?" He stepped closer, though he hadn't yet crossed her threshold. "You know I'm not like your other patients." Behind her, the bat pups began their melodious singing again, and she saw recognition flicker in the stranger's pale eyes. His gaze moved past her to the basket by the fire, and his entire demeanor shifted, still commanding, but touched now with something that might have been tenderness. "You saved them," he said, and there was wonder in his voice. "They were dying." Elsbeth stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. "Would you have me let them freeze?" He moved into her cottage with fluid grace, seeming to take up more space than his physical form should have occupied. The very air around him felt charged, like the moments before lightning strikes. As he approached the fireplace, the bat pups climbed eagerly up the sides of their basket, their tiny voices rising in what could only be described as joy. "My kin," he murmured, extending one pale hand towards them. They scrambled onto his fingers without hesitation, settling into his palm as if they had always belonged there. I felt their distress through the forest bond. I searched for days. Forest bond? Elsbeth moved closer, fascinated despite herself by the obvious connection between this mysterious man and the creatures she'd rescued. He looked up at her, and in his ancient eyes she saw something she hadn't expected. Vulnerability. "You would not believe me if I told you. Try me." The words hung between them in the firelit air of her cottage. Outside, the fog continued to swirl around Thornwick, but inside this small space, something was shifting. Elsbeth could feel it, a change as fundamental as the turning of seasons, as irreversible as the passage of time. "I am Lucien," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "Lord of the night realm that borders your village, guardian of the ancient pacts that keep the balance between your world and mine." He paused, studying her face for signs of disbelief or fear. "And these little ones you saved are my blood, as surely as if they were born of my own flesh." "Vampire?" Elsbeth said quietly, the word settling into the space between them with surprising ease. His eyebrows rose slightly. "You accept this quickly?" "I've seen too much in my years of healing to dismiss anything outright." She settled into her chair by the fire, noting how he remained standing, poised as if ready to flee at the first sign of rejection. Though I admit, vampires were not among my usual considerations. The forest pact is ancient, Lucien continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting something sacred. It binds my kind to protect the villages on our borders, and villagers to show sanctuary to any of our blood who seek it. You honored that pact, perhaps without knowing it existed. And now? The question seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment, his composed mask slipped, revealing something almost boyish in its uncertainty. Now, he said slowly, I find myself bound to you by laws older than your village, stronger than death itself. Around her throat, Elsbeth felt a sudden warmth. Looking down, she gasped to see a pendant she had never worn before, a silver amulet in the shape of a crescent moon, glowing with the same pale light that emanated from the fog. As she watched, it pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. The blood moon rises tomorrow, Lucien said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. By its laws and the debt of sanctuary you're owed, I claim you as my eternal mate, Elsbeth of Thornwick, not as prey, not as servant, but as my equal in all things. The words should have terrified her. Instead, she felt a strange sense of completion, as if a part of her she hadn't known was missing had suddenly been restored. The pendant around her throat pulsed brighter, and she understood with certainty that her quiet life of healing and solitude had just come to an end. Dawn broke over Thornwick with the crystalline clarity that comes only after fog has lifted, leaving the world washed clean and strangely empty. Elsbeth woke in her narrow bed with the disorienting sensation that something fundamental had shifted during the night, though for a moment she couldn't recall what. Then her hand moved to her throat and found the pendant, the silver crescent moon that hadn't been there when she'd gone to sleep. The blood moon pendant was warm against her skin, pulsing gently with each heartbeat as if it had become part of her circulatory system. She sat up slowly, her practical mind immediately beginning to catalogue evidence that the previous night hadn't been an elaborate dream brought on by winter fever or too much willow bark tea. Her cottage bore the subtle signs of supernatural visitation. The air still carried a hint of something otherworldly, not unpleasant, but distinctly different from her usual mixture of herbs and wood smoke. The bat pup's basket sat empty by the fireplace, though she distinctly remembered them being returned to their wool nest before Lucien had vanished back into the fog. More telling were the footprints visible through her front window. The frost had preserved them perfectly, boot prints too large and too precisely placed to belong to any of her usual visitors. They led from her door to the forest path, growing fainter, but never quite disappearing until they reached the tree line, where darkness swallowed all traces. Elsbeth dressed with deliberate care, choosing her warmest woolen dress and her sturdiest boots. Whatever came next, she suspected it would require all her strength and composure. The pendant seemed to pulse more strongly as she moved about her morning routine, as if responding to her emotional state. The village was stirring to life as she stepped outside, and immediately she sensed the difference in atmosphere. People moved about their morning tasks with the quick, nervous energy of those who had slept poorly. Mrs. Aldrich was hanging washing with unusual haste, glancing frequently toward the forest. Young Timothy hurried past without his usual cheerful greeting, his eyes wide with the hollow look of someone who had seen something he couldn't explain. At the village well, the usual morning gathering of women drew quiet when Elsbeth approached. Margaret and Agnes were there, along with several others, their voices dropping to whispers as she filled her water bucket. "Strange night," Margaret ventured cautiously. Did you hear the sounds from the forest? What sort of sounds? Elsbeth asked, though she suspected she knew. Singing, said young Mary, the baker's wife. But not like any human voice. It echoed through the fog like angels almost. Agnes shot her a sharp look. Angels don't sing in winter fog, child. More likely something far less holy. You felt it too, didn't you, Elsbeth? Margaret's eyes searched her face with the perception that came from years of friendship. That feeling like the very air was holding its breath? Elsbeth nodded slowly. The fog was unusual. Father Marcus says we should pray for protection, Mrs. Aldrich added, her voice tight with anxiety. He's called for special evening services all this week. The mention of the village priest sent an uncomfortable chill through Elsbeth. Father Marcus had always been suspicious of her healing work, tolerating it only because the village needed her skills. If he decided her unusual knowledge came from unholy sources, her peaceful life could become very complicated indeed. She finished her tasks at the well and made her way toward the village centre, where the iron cross stood as Thornwick's spiritual anchor. The ancient marker had been erected by the first Christian settlers, its black metal supposedly blessed by priests from the great cathedral in the distant capital. Local legend claimed it could ward off evil influences, and many villagers touched it for luck before travelling beyond the village boundaries. As Elsbeth approached the cross, she noticed something that made her steps falter. The iron bore scorch marks, not from fire, but as if something intensely cold had touched it and left its impression in the metal. The marks were roughly hand-shaped, with long fingers that could have belonged to the mysterious Lucien. Troubling, isn't it? The voice belonged to Father Marcus, who emerged from behind the cross with the silent footsteps that made him so effective at catching parishioners in minor transgressions. He was a lean man in his 40s, with prematurely grey hair and eyes that seemed to see sin in the smallest pleasures. His black robes rustled as he moved, and the wooden crucifix at his chest caught the morning light. The marks appeared during the night, he continued, studying her face intently, along with reports of unnatural phenomena throughout the village. Iron can crack in extreme cold, Elsbeth offered carefully. Indeed. His smile was thin and sharp. Though these temperatures are hardly extreme by winter standards, tell me, Elsbeth, did you experience anything unusual last night? The pendant beneath her dress pulsed warmly, and she fought the urge to touch it. The fog was thicker than normal. Fog. Father Marcus circled the cross slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. Mrs. Aldrich mentioned seeing lights near your cottage, strange lights that had no earthly source. I retired early, Elsbeth said. I'm afraid I wouldn't know about any lights. But even as she spoke, she could feel the lie sitting uncomfortably on her tongue. Father Marcus had always been able to sense deception, a skill that served him well in the confessional, but made casual conversation feel like an interrogation. I'm concerned about you, my daughter. His voice carried the paternal tone he used when delivering warnings. A woman alone, especially one who spends so much time gathering herbs in the forest, can become vulnerable to influences that prey on isolation and grief. I'm quite well, Father. Are you? He gestured toward the scorch marks on the cross. Because I fear something unholy walked among us last night, and those who have truck with such things often find themselves marked by the association. The accusation hung in the cold morning air like a challenge. Elsbeth felt a surge of the same calm that had sustained her through her encounter with Lucien, the professional composure that came from years of making life-and-death decisions under pressure. If you're suggesting I've been practicing witchcraft, Father Marcus, you're welcome to search my cottage. You'll find nothing but the herbs and remedies I've been using to heal this village for 28 years. His eyes glittered with something that might have been disappointment. "I make no accusations, Elsbeth. I merely express concern for your spiritual welfare. Perhaps more prayer and less time alone in the forest would benefit your soul." "My soul is my own concern," she replied quietly, "as my healing work is my calling." She turned to leave, but his voice followed her. "The old ways are dying, Elsbeth. The time when villages tolerated wise women and forest gatherers is passing. The church grows stronger each year, and with it, the Jedana intolerance for anything that smacks of paganism." The warning was clear enough. Father Marcus suspected her of something, if not outright witchcraft, then at least dangerous sympathies with pre-Christian traditions. The pendant against her throat pulsed more rapidly, responding to her rising anxiety. As she walked home through the village streets, Elsbeth became increasingly aware of the subtle changes in her neighbors' behavior. Conversations stopped when she approached. Children were called inside with unusual haste. Even Gareth the blacksmith, who had always been friendly, avoided meeting her eyes as she passed his forge. By afternoon, the isolation had become undeniable. No one came to her cottage seeking remedies. No mothers brought their children for the minor ailments that usually filled her days. It was as if the entire village had decided, overnight, that Elsbeth of Thornwick was no longer quite trustworthy. The realization brought with it a familiar ache, the same feeling she'd experienced after Edmund's death, when his absence had created a hole in her daily routine that nothing seemed able to fill. But this was different, more complex. She wasn't grieving a loss so much as recognizing the end of one phase of her life and the terrifying beginning of another. As evening approached and shadows lengthened across her garden, Elsbeth found herself watching the forest with new eyes. Somewhere beyond those trees, Lucien existed in a world she could barely imagine. His claim on her, spoken with such certainty the night before, had seemed like something from a fairy tale in the harsh light of day. Now, as darkness gathered and the pendant grew warm against her skin, she began to understand that fairy tales might be more real than she had ever supposed. As night fell over Thornwick for the second time since Lucien's appearance, Elsbeth found herself pacing her cottage with an energy that had nothing to do with her usual evening routine. The pendant at her throat had grown increasingly warm throughout the day, and now it pulsed with a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with something beyond her own heartbeat, as if it were responding to an approaching presence. She had spent the afternoon in unwanted solitude, her usual stream of patients conspicuously absent. The silence had given her time to think, perhaps more time than was comfortable. Every rational part of her mind insisted that the previous night had been some elaborate hallucination brought on by winter isolation and the stress of caring for unusual creatures. Yet the pendant's weight against her skin and the scorch marks on the village cross suggested a reality far stranger than anything her practical experience had prepared her for. The sound of footsteps on the frost-hard ground brought her to the window. This time, she recognized the measured pace and confident stride before the figure emerged from the shadows between her birch trees. Lucien moved through the darkness, as if it were his natural element, the pale moonlight seeming to gather around him rather than illuminate him from above. She opened the door before he could knock. "You came back," she said, surprising herself with how much relief colored her voice. "Did you think I wouldn't?" His pale eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her feel as if he were reading her thoughts. "You're troubled. The village suspects something." She stepped aside to let him enter, noting again how his presence seemed to charge the very air of her cottage. "Father Marcus questioned me this morning about unusual phenomena. There are scorch marks on the iron cross." Lucien's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Iron burns my kind, as surely as fire burns yours. I should have been more careful. Your kind." Elsbeth settled into her chair by the fireplace, gesturing for him to take the seat Edmund had once favoured. "Tell me what that means exactly. What you are, what this pendant signifies, what you meant by claiming me as your eternal mate." He remained standing for a moment, studying her with the wariness of someone unaccustomed to being questioned so directly. Then, with fluid grace, he lowered himself into the offered chair. In the firelight, his otherworldly beauty became more apparent. The too perfect symmetry of his features, the pale skin that seemed to glow with its own inner light, the absolute stillness that marked him as something beyond merely human. "I am what your people call vampire," he began, his voice taking on the formal cadence she'd noticed the night before. Though the word carries connotations that don't quite capture the truth of what we are. We are not the demons of your father Marcus's sermons, nor the monsters of village stories told to frighten children. What are you, then? We are the guardians of the deep places, the keepers of balances your kind cannot see or understand. For centuries beyond counting, my people have existed alongside yours, protecting the borders between the world of daylight and the realm of shadow. From a fold in his dark coat, Lucien produced something that made Elsbeth's breath catch, a hand mirror unlike any she had ever seen. Its surface was not glass, but something that seemed to capture and hold light, reflecting not just images but something deeper. The frame was wrought silver, carved with symbols that hurt her eyes to look at directly. "The mirror of truth," he said, offering it to her with ceremonial care. "It will show you what the pendant means, what bond exists between us now." Elsbeth took the mirror with hands that trembled only slightly. The metal was warm to the touch, almost alive, and when she looked into its surface, she gasped. The reflection showed her face, but changed, her features subtly refined, her skin luminous with the same pale radiance that marked Lucien. Her eyes, normally a pleasant hazel, gleamed with amber fire. Most startling of all, the pendant at her throat blazed like a captured star, its light seeming to pulse in harmony with her heartbeat. "This is what I could become," she whispered. "What you will become, if you choose it." Lucien's voice was gentle now, stripped of its earlier formality. "The pendant bonds us, but it does not compel. The choice of transformation must be freely given, or the magic will not hold." She set the mirror aside carefully, her mind racing through implications she was only beginning to grasp. Immortality? Yes, though not without cost. You would leave behind the mortal world, the ability to bear children, the simple pleasure of growing old alongside friends. You would watch generations of your village live and die while you remained unchanged. And if I refuse? The question seemed to cause him physical pain. His composed mask slipped, revealing something raw and vulnerable beneath. Then the bond will fade with the next full moon, and you will return to your mortal life. I will respect your choice and trouble you no more. But I have lived for 800 years, Elsbeth, and in all that time, I have never felt what I felt when I watched you save my kin. You showed compassion to creatures you didn't understand, kindness without expectation of reward. You faced my presence without terror, accepted my nature without condemnation. He paused, his ancient eyes fixed on hers. I have been alone for so long, I had forgotten what it meant to hope for companionship. The honesty in his voice moved her more than any declaration of love might have. Here was a being of immense power and age, admitting to loneliness with the simplicity of a child. It resonated with her own quiet years of solitude, the careful contentment she'd built around the absence of deep connection. "Tell me about your world," she said quietly. "If I were to choose this path, what would my life become?" Relief flickered across his features, as if her question itself represented a victory. "We live in harmony with the natural world, guardians of ancient places and keeper of old knowledge. You would retain your healing abilities, but enhanced beyond anything you can imagine. Disease, injury, even death itself would bend to your will. And you? What would you gain from this bond?" "A partner." The word seemed to carry centuries of weight. An equal to share the burden of guardianship. Someone whose wisdom and compassion could guide decisions that affect both our peoples. The vampire courts have grown, isolated in recent centuries. They have forgotten the value of connection to the mortal world. You could help bridge that gap. Outside, a wolf howled somewhere deep in the forest, an unusual sound so close to the village. Lucien's head turned sharply toward the window, his entire body going rigid with attention. "What is it?" "Others of my kind," he said grimly. "They've discovered my presence here. Not all of them approve of bonds with mortals, especially not bonds that could grant a human equal status in our hierarchy." The pendant at Elsbeth's throat pulsed more rapidly, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air seeping through her shutters. "Are we in danger?" "You are under my protection," Lucien said, rising from his chair with predatory grace. "But yes, there may be complications." As if summoned by his words, a sound echoed through the night, not quite human, not quite animal, but something that made every instinct Elsbeth possessed scream warnings of mortal peril. The howl was answered by another, then another, until the forest around Thornwick rang with voices that spoke of hunger and ancient anger. "They come," Lucien murmured, his hand moving to something concealed beneath his coat. "The old guard, who would see our kind remain forever separate from yours." Elsbeth felt something shift inside her, not fear, but a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. Whatever was coming for them, whatever challenges lay ahead, she realized with startling clarity that she was no longer willing to face them alone. The pendant blazed against her throat like a falling star, and in its light she saw her future reflected in Lucien's ancient eyes. The attack came with the swift brutality of a winter storm. One moment, Elsbeth's cottage was filled with the gentle warmth of firelight and quiet conversation. The next, the shutters exploded inward as 3 figures burst through her windows in a cascade of splintered wood and glass. They moved with inhuman speed, their forms blurring as they surrounded Lucien with predatory grace. In the chaos of the moment, Elsbeth caught only impressions: pale skin, eyes that reflected light like a cat's, teeth that were altogether too sharp for any earthly creature. But what struck her most forcefully was their age. These were not newly made vampires, but ancient beings whose very presence seemed to drain warmth from the air. Lucien was on his feet instantly, something long and wickedly curved appearing in his hand. The weapon gleamed with its own inner light. Not silver, but something darker and more primal. Only later would she learn it was carved from thornwood, a tree that grew only in the deepest parts of the supernatural realm, its branches capable of harming both mortal and immortal flesh. "Seraphim," he said, his voice carrying a note of weary recognition. "I wondered when the council would send their hunters." The largest of the 3 attackers, a woman with hair like spun platinum and a face that might have been carved from marble, smiled with cold amusement, Did you think we wouldn't notice, Lucien? The bond light blazes like a beacon across the supernatural realm. Every creature of shadow for 100 miles can sense what you've done." "What I've done is honor the ancient laws," Lucien replied, shifting position to place himself more squarely between the intruders and Elsbeth. "The Pact of Sanctuary creates bonds. I merely acknowledged what already existed." "You've perverted sacred law for your own desires," snarled a second vampire, this one male with scars that spoke of battles fought across centuries. "No mortal has been granted equal bonding in 500 years. The Council will not permit it." "The Council," said the third attacker, younger seeming but with eyes older than winter, "didn't send us to negotiate. They moved as one, a coordinated assault that spoke of centuries fighting together. But Lucien was ready for them, the thornwood staff spinning in patterns too quick for mortal eyes to follow. The sound of their combat was unlike anything Elsbeth had ever heard. Not the clash of metal on metal, but something that resonated deeper, as if the very air itself was being torn. She pressed herself against the wall beside her herb shelf, her healer's instincts screaming at her to flee, while something deeper and newer demanded she find a way to help. The pendant at her throat blazed with such intensity she could feel its heat through her dress, and with that heat came something unexpected: knowledge. The bond Lucien had spoken of was more than metaphor. As the pendant pulsed, she found herself aware of his thoughts, his emotions, the desperate focus required to hold off 3 opponents whose combined age measured in millennia. She felt his fear, not for himself, but for her. His determination to protect her regardless of the cost. And underneath it all, a love so vast and patient, it took her breath away. But she also sensed something else, a weakness in his left shoulder, where an old injury had never quite healed, a slight hesitation when facing the scarred male vampire who had clearly bested him in combat before. The knowledge came through the bond like whispered secrets, and with it came power. Without fully understanding what she was doing, Elsbeth reached for that power. The effect was immediate and startling. Light erupted from the pendant, not the gentle silver glow it had shown before, but something fierce and blazing that filled her cottage with radiance. The attacking vampires recoiled with hisses of pain, their perfect features twisting into something altogether more predatory. "Impossible," whispered the platinum-haired woman. "She's still mortal. The bond shouldn't be strong enough." Her words cut off as Elsbeth stepped forward, guided by instincts she didn't know she possessed. The light emanating from the pendant spread down her arms, and where it touched her skin, strange symbols appeared, flowing script in a language she couldn't read, but somehow understood. "You're right," Elsbeth said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the cottage walls vibrate. "I am still mortal. But mortality is not weakness, and I will not stand by while you threaten what is mine." The scarred vampire lunged toward her, clearly intending to remove the unexpected threat. But Lucien was there, the thornwood staff intercepting claws that would have opened her throat. The impact sent both combatants crashing into her work table, scattering herbs and precious bottles across the floor. "Enough!" The shout came from Elsbeth herself, and with it came a pulse of power that froze all 4 vampires in place. The cottage fell silent, except for the crackle of disturbed flames and the soft tinkle of settling glass. In that moment of stillness, she understood what was happening to her. The bond wasn't just connecting her to Lucien, it was awakening something that had always existed within her bloodline. Dormant power passed down through generations of wise women who had served as bridges between the mortal and supernatural worlds. Her grandmother's unusual knowledge of herbs that didn't grow in their region, Her own inexplicable success with remedies that should have been beyond her training, the way wounded animals sought her out as if drawn by instinct. It all made sense now. "You cannot have him," she said to the three intruders, her voice steady despite the cosmic forces flowing through her. "And you cannot break what has been freely chosen." The platinum-haired vampire, Seraphim, tilted her head with something that might have been respect. "The awakening changes things," she admitted grudgingly. "If she carries the old blood, the council laws are more complex." "She carries it," Lucien said, quietly, lowering his weapon but not relaxing his guard. "Can't you sense it? The bloodline of the original pact-makers runs strong in her." "Strong enough to challenge the hierarchy," added the younger vampire, his tone mixing fascination with unease. "Strong enough to demand recognition." Elsbeth felt the power beginning to ebb, leaving her dizzy and strangely hollow. But the knowledge remained, settling into her consciousness like memories returning after a long fever. She was more than she had ever imagined, not just a village healer, but the descendant of women who had shaped the supernatural politics of entire regions. "What does this mean?" she asked, though part of her already knew. Seraphim exchanged glances with her companions before answering. "It means mortal who is more than mortal, that your bonding to Lucien is no longer a simple matter of personal choice. It becomes a political act that could reshape the balance of power between the vampire courts and the human world. It means," added the scarred vampire with what might have been a smile, "that you have 3 days to prove your worthiness before the full council arrives, to judge whether your awakening represents opportunity or threat." "And if they judge it a threat?" Elsbeth asked, though she suspected she wouldn't like the answer. "Then they will ensure it never happens again," Seraphim replied with brutal honesty, "by whatever means necessary." The 3 vampires departed as suddenly as they had arrived, leaving only shattered shutters and the lingering scent of otherworldly power. In the aftermath, Elsbeth sank into her chair by the fire, her body shaking with reaction to forces she was only beginning to understand. Lucien knelt beside her, his pale eyes dark with concern and something deeper, a reverence that made her uncomfortable. "You saved us both," he said quietly. "I have never seen power manifest so quickly or so completely." "I don't understand what's happening to me," she admitted. "You're becoming who you were always meant to be," he replied, taking her hands in his. "The question now is whether we can convince the council that change is not always destruction, that some bonds are worth the risk of transformation." Outside, snow began to fall, soft, silent flakes that covered the evidence of supernatural combat and made the world appear peaceful once more. But Elsbeth knew that peace was illusion now. In 3 days, she would face judgment from beings whose power dwarfed anything she had yet encountered. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt only a calm determination that surprised her with its strength. Whatever came next, she would meet it as herself, village healer, awakened bloodline heir, and woman who had chosen love over fear, regardless of the consequences. The next morning brought consequences that rippled through Thornwick like stones cast into still water. Word of the supernatural battle had spread despite the late hour. Too many villagers had witnessed the unnatural light blazing from Elsbeth's cottage, heard sounds that had no earthly explanation, seen the 3 figures departing, with movements too fluid for human limbs. By noon, Father Marcus stood at Elsbeth's door with a delegation of village elders, their faces set in expressions of righteous concern that barely masked deeper fears. Behind them clustered a dozen more villagers, kept at a respectful distance but clearly united in purpose. Margaret and Agnes were notably absent from the group, an absence that spoke volumes about how thoroughly her support had eroded. "Elsbeth of Thornwick," Father Marcus began formally, his voice carrying the authority of both church and community leadership, "you will come with us to answer charges of trafficking with demons and practicing forbidden arts." She faced them through her broken doorway. She hadn't bothered to repair the shutters shattered in the previous night's conflict, with the same calm she had always brought to crisis. But something fundamental had changed in her bearing. The awakening of her bloodline heritage had left its mark in subtle ways. Her posture was more erect, her gaze more direct, and around her throat the pendant pulsed with a light visible even in daylight. "What charges, specifically?" she asked, noting how several villagers made the sign of the cross when they glimpsed the pendant's glow. "Witchcraft," declared Henrik the Cooper, his weathered face twisted with fear and anger. "Unnatural lights, demon voices, and congress with creatures that have no place in God's creation." "I've been healing this village for 28 years, Elsbeth replied quietly. "Have my remedies ever failed? Have I ever asked for anything beyond what my services were worth? Have I ever brought harm to anyone under my care?" "That was before," said Mrs. Aldrich, clutching a wooden cross so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "Before you brought those cursed creatures into your home, before you began consorting with demons that leave scorch marks on holy iron." The pendant at Elsbeth's throat pulsed more brightly, responding to her rising emotions. She could feel power gathering beneath her skin like water behind a dam, and with it came knowledge that would have terrified her days earlier. She knew, with absolute certainty, that she could compel these people to leave her in peace. The awakened bloodline granted authority over mortal minds, influence that could reshape memory and perception with nothing more than focused will. The temptation was overwhelming, and precisely why she rejected it. "I will come," she said simply, stepping out of her cottage and closing the damaged door behind her. "But not as a prisoner. I'll answer your questions freely because you deserve truth, not because you have power to compel it." The gesture clearly surprised Father Marcus, whose prepared arguments for overcoming resistance fell flat in the face of willing cooperation. He had expected defiance, perhaps even supernatural retaliation. Instead, he found himself walking beside a woman who moved with quiet dignity toward what might well be her own condemnation. They gathered in the village common, before the iron cross that still bore scorch marks from Lucien's touch. Someone had attempted to scrub away the evidence, but the metal remained darkened in the shape of elongated fingers. The sight of it sent murmurs through the assembled crowd, confirmation that the supernatural had indeed touched their quiet world. "Show us," Father Marcus demanded, once the villagers had arranged themselves in a rough circle around Elsbeth. "Show us the source of the unnatural light that blazed from your dwelling." Without hesitation, Elsbeth drew the pendant from beneath her dress. The reaction was immediate. Gasps of fear, cries of recognition, hands raised to ward off evil influence. The silver crescent moon blazed like captured starlight, its radiance visible even in the pale afternoon sun. "This was given to me," she said calmly, "by one who honored the ancient laws of sanctuary and protection. It marks a bond freely chosen and willingly entered." "Demon's work," Henrik spat. "No Christian soul would accept such a cursed token." "And yet I stand here among you," Elsbeth replied, speaking truth in the sight of God and neighbors who have known me since childhood. If this pendant carried demonic influence, would it not corrupt my nature? Would you not see evidence of evil in my actions? It was Father Marcus who provided the answer she had been leading them toward. "Evil is subtle," he said, but his conviction seemed forced. "It seduces through seeming kindness, through gifts that appear beneficial but carry hidden costs. Then examine those costs, Elsbeth challenged. What harm has befallen Thornwick since I accepted this bond? What evidence do you have of corruption or malevolent influence? The question hung in the air unanswered because, despite their fears, none of them could point to actual harm. The previous night's battle had damaged only her cottage, threatened only her person. No villagers had been hurt, no children terrorized, no livestock slaughtered by supernatural forces. Into the uncomfortable silence came an unexpected voice. That of Timothy, the young man who had seemed so frightened that morning. The singing, he said hesitantly, the voices in the fog. They weren't threatening. They were beautiful. Demons' music to lure souls astray, Father Marcus snapped, but Timothy shook his head. No, Father. I've heard demons' music in my nightmares since I was small. This was different. It was like angels greeting the dawn, if angels sang in languages we'd forgotten. Other voices began to join his, tentative at first, then growing bolder as people admitted their true feelings about the supernatural encounter. Yes, they had been frightened by the unknown, but the fear had been of strangeness, not of malevolence. The lights, the voices, even the overwhelming presence of otherworldly power had carried no sense of threat to those who weren't directly involved in the conflict. She saved creatures that were dying, added Mary, the baker's wife. Whatever else has happened, it began with an act of compassion. Compassion can be corrupted, Father Marcus insisted, but his support was clearly eroding. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Yes. Elsbeth's voice carried new authority now, the awakened bloodline lending weight to her words. But it is also true that good intentions, freely chosen and steadfastly maintained, can light the path to redemption. From her sleeve, she withdrew something that made several villagers step back in alarm. A ring of deep red stone set in silver, its surface carved with symbols that seemed to shift and flow in the afternoon light. This was the bloodstone ring Lucien had shown her the night before, explaining that it would be needed for the formal bonding ceremony should she choose to proceed. I am offered a choice, she said, holding the ring so all could see it. To bond myself to one who has lived centuries beyond mortal span, to accept transformation that would grant me power over life and death itself. In 3 days, I must decide whether to accept this path or return to the life I've always known. Choose your mortal life, Father Marcus urged, his voice carrying genuine concern beneath the religious authority. Choose the familiar path of service to God and community. This other way leads only to damnation. Elsbeth looked around the circle of faces. Some frightened, some curious, some openly hostile, but all familiar. These were people she had delivered, healed, comforted through loss and celebration. They represented 30 years of service, of relationships built through shared humanity and mutual care. I ask for 3 days, she said finally. 3 days to pray, to consider, to seek guidance from sources both earthly and divine. At the end of that time, I will choose openly, before all of you, so that no one can say I was coerced or deceived. It was Father Marcus who broke the long silence that followed. And if you choose the supernatural path, if you accept this, bonding with creatures that exist outside God's plan, then I will leave Thornwick, Elsbeth replied, the words costing her more than she had expected. I will trouble this village no more with my presence or my choices. The murmur that ran through the crowd held notes of relief and regret in equal measure. They wanted her gone, the familiar woman who had become strange and threatening, but they also knew what they would be losing. Thornwick had no other healer with her knowledge and experience. Her departure would leave a gap that might take years to fill. 3 days, Father Marcus agreed reluctantly. But you will remain in your cottage, and you will receive no visitors save myself and the village council. We will not risk further supernatural contamination while you make your choice. As the crowd dispersed, Elsbeth walked home alone through streets where she had walked freely for decades. Children watched her pass from doorways and windows, their young faces reflecting confusion rather than fear. They didn't understand why the kind woman who had tended their scraped knees and fevered dreams was suddenly being treated as a threat. Behind her, she could hear the murmur of adult conversation, plans being made, precautions discussed, the slow machinery of community judgment grinding into motion. In 3 days, one way or another, her life in Thornwick would end. The realization should have devastated her. Instead, as she reached her cottage and saw Lucien waiting in the shadows of her garden, she felt only a quiet certainty that some endings were actually beginnings in disguise. The bloodstone ring pulsed warm against her palm, and she knew her choice had already been made. The next 3 days would simply give her time to find the courage to speak it aloud. The revelation came on the 2nd day of Elsbeth's isolation, delivered by the last person she would have expected to carry such earth-shaking news. Father Marcus arrived at her cottage, not with the village council, but alone, carrying a burden that had aged him visibly since their confrontation at the Iron Cross. He knocked with the hesitancy of someone approaching a task that went against every instinct, then waited as she opened the door to find him clutching a leather satchel that looked far older than anything that should exist in their modest village church. "I must speak with you," he said without preamble, his eyes avoiding hers. "About truths I have kept hidden for longer than you have been alive." Elsbeth studied his face, noting the deep lines of exhaustion and the way his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the ancient satchel. Whatever he had come to tell her had cost him sleep and peace of mind in equal measure. "Come in," she said, stepping aside to let him enter her cottage. The space still bore evidence of the supernatural battle, broken shutters, scorch marks on the walls where otherworldly power had touched them, a lingering scent of magic that no amount of cleaning could eliminate. Father Marcus moved to the center of the room and set his burden carefully on her work table. The satchel was made of leather so old it had taken on the color and texture of parchment, bound with iron clasps that bore symbols she had seen before, carved into the bloodstone ring, etched into the pendant at her throat, woven through the very fabric of the supernatural forces that had claimed her life. "Before I say what I have come to say," he began, his voice heavy with the weight of confession, "you must understand that everything I am about to tell you, I swore before God never to reveal. My ordination, my calling to serve this village, even my presence here, all of it has been in service to a secret I have carried for 27 years. He opened the satchel with reverent care, revealing contents that transformed Elsbeth's understanding of everything she thought she knew about her life, her heritage, and the supernatural forces that had claimed her. The first item he withdrew was a scroll, not paper or parchment, but something that seemed to be made of silver and shadow, its surface inscribed with text that moved and shifted even as she watched. The original pact scroll, though she didn't know its name yet, contained the foundational agreements that had governed relations between the vampire courts and mortal settlements for over 1,000 years. "This," Father Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper, "is the covenant your great-grandmother signed in blood and starlight when the vampire Lord Aurelius sought to establish peaceful borders between his realm and the mortal settlements of this region. Elsbeth felt the air leave her lungs as if she'd been struck. My great-grandmother? Morgana of the Thornwick line, he confirmed, withdrawing a second document, this one conventional parchment, bearing a woman's elegant script. She was not merely a wise woman or village healer. She was the last of the bloodline pact-makers, women born with the power to bridge the gap between mortal and immortal worlds. The priest's words unlocked memories that weren't quite her own, inherited knowledge that had lain dormant until the pendant's awakening had stirred it to life. Images flashed through her mind. A woman with her own features, but bearing an authority that could command both mortal nobles and supernatural lords, standing before an assembly of creatures that defied description, negotiating terms that would preserve peace across generations. The pact established more than just borders, Father Marcus continued, his academic training evident in the careful way he explained complex supernatural politics. It created a bloodline obligation. Each generation of Morgana's descendants would serve as potential mediators should the need arise. Most lived normal lives, their heritage dormant unless specifically awakened. But mine wasn't dormant, Elsbeth said, understanding flooding through her as pieces clicked into place. The healing abilities, the way animals sought me out, my success with remedies that should have been beyond my knowledge. All evidence of your true heritage, he confirmed. Your late husband knew. Edmund sought me out before your marriage, asking questions about your family history that made it clear he suspected something unusual about your bloodline. The mention of Edmund sent a shock through her that was part grief, part betrayal, part relief at finally understanding mysteries that had puzzled her for years. He knew what I was? From the satchel, Father Marcus withdrew a final item, a letter bearing Edmund's careful handwriting, sealed with wax that had somehow remained unbroken through 5 years since his death. He left this with instructions that it should only be given to you if the supernatural world ever called upon your heritage, the priest explained. I had hoped, prayed, that such a day would never come. Elsbeth took the letter with hands that shook only slightly, breaking the seal with the reverence due to final words from a beloved husband. Edmund's voice seemed to speak through the careful script. My dearest Elsbeth, if you are reading this, then the time of hiding is over, and you must claim the inheritance I helped you avoid for as long as possible. I married you, knowing what blood ran in your veins, knowing that someday the supernatural world might demand its due. I do not regret a single moment of our time together, nor the choice to let you live as an ordinary woman while such a life remained possible. Your great-grandmother's pact was not just political convenience, but a binding of souls that transcends death itself. The vampire lord Aurelius pledged that his line would honor the alliance across centuries, and in return, Morgana bound her descendants to answer when that honor was called upon. Lucien is Aurelius's direct heir, his son in the ways that matter to immortal beings. His claim upon you is not arbitrary desire, but fulfillment of oaths sworn when this region was nothing but wilderness and hope. You are not his victim, but his equal in a partnership that could reshape the balance between mortal and supernatural realms. I have watched you heal our neighbors, seen you show compassion to creatures others fear, witnessed the gentle strength that marks you as truly worthy of the power you carry. Do not fear what you must become. Trust in the love that brought us together and the wisdom that has guided your healing work. You were born to be a bridge between worlds, my darling. Build it well. Your devoted husband, Edmund. Silence filled the cottage as Elsbeth absorbed the full implications of what she had learned. Everything she had believed about her life, her marriage, even her calling as a healer had been built on incomplete understanding. She was not a village woman who had stumbled into supernatural circumstances, but the inheritor of a legacy that had shaped regional politics for centuries. "Why?" she asked finally, looking up at Father Marcus with new understanding of his role in her life. "Why did you help hide this from me?" The priest's expression was complex, part relief at finally sharing his burden, part regret for the deception he had maintained. "Because I believed, perhaps wrongly, that ignorance would protect you, that if you never awakened to your true nature, the supernatural world would pass you by and leave you to live the peaceful life you seemed to want. And now? Now I see that peace built on willful ignorance is no peace at all," he admitted. "The forces that shaped your bloodline will not be denied forever. Perhaps it is better that they claim you through love rather than duty alone." From outside came the sound of approaching footsteps, not the measured pace of villagers going about their daily business, but the coordinated movement of multiple beings moving with supernatural grace. Through her broken shutters, Elsbeth could see figures emerging from the forest, their forms too perfect to be merely human. "The Vampire Council," Father Marcus said grimly. "They arrive early." But Elsbeth was no longer the uncertain woman who had rescued bat pups from winter cold. The knowledge of her heritage had awakened not just power, but purpose. She understood now that her choice was not between mortal life and supernatural transformation, but between accepting the destiny her bloodline had always carried or abandoning the role she was born to fulfill. "Then we will meet them," she said, rising from her chair with newfound authority. "Not as supplicants seeking mercy, but as inheritors of an ancient covenant claiming our rightful place." The pendant at her throat blazed with silver fire as she spoke, and around them both the very air seemed to thicken with possibility. The cottage that had been her sanctuary was transforming into something far more significant, the site where centuries of careful balance between mortal and immortal realms would either be renewed or shattered forever. Through the approaching darkness, shapes moved with the fluid grace of creatures who had never known mortality. The Vampire Council had come to judge whether her awakening represented opportunity or threat. Looking at the evidence of her true heritage spread across her work table, the ancient pact, Edmund's final letter, the artifacts that had guided her bloodline across generations, Elsbeth felt a calm certainty settle over her like a familiar cloak. She knew which judgment she intended them to reach. The Vampire Council arrived with the majesty of a winter storm given form and purpose. 7 figures emerged from the forest darkness, each one radiating power that made the earlier confrontation with Seraphim and her companions seem like a mere skirmish. They moved in formation, not the loose coordination of hunting companions, but the precise order of beings who had governed supernatural realms for millennia. At their center walked a figure who could only be the Council's supreme leader. Tall beyond human proportion, with silver hair that seemed to capture and hold moonlight, she carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to reshaping reality with nothing more than focused will. The crown of shadows rested upon her brow, not a physical object, but a manifestation of pure supernatural authority that hurt mortal eyes to look upon directly. Elsbeth watched their approach from her cottage window, Father Marcus beside her, clutching the ancient documents that had redefined her understanding of her own existence. The priest's face was pale with terror, but his hands remained steady as he helped her prepare for what might be the most important negotiation in centuries. "Lady Valdris," he murmured, identifying the council leader. She is older than written history, more powerful than any creature still walking the earth. If she has come personally, then they take this matter very seriously indeed, Elsbeth finished, surprising herself with how calm her voice sounded. The pendant at her throat pulsed steadily, its rhythm matching her heartbeat in a way that suggested deep, magical synchronization. Through its connection, she could sense Lucien approaching from another direction. Not hiding, but making his presence known in a way that declared his intention to stand with her regardless of consequences. The council arranged themselves in a semicircle before her cottage, their positioning clearly deliberate. Each member represented a different aspect of vampire society: the warrior lords who maintained supernatural borders, the scholar mages who preserved ancient knowledge, the diplomats who negotiated with other immortal races. Together, they embodied the full power and authority of a civilization that predated human recorded history. Lady Valdris stepped forward, her voice carrying across the distance between them with supernatural clarity. Elsbeth, daughter of the Thornwick bloodline, inheritor of Morgana's covenant, we call upon you to present yourself for judgment. There was no choice but to answer. Elsbeth stepped out of her cottage into the cold night air, Father Marcus following with the leather satchel containing proof of her heritage. Behind her, she could hear the faint sounds of village life, people preparing for sleep, unaware that their quiet world balanced on the edge of transformation. "I present myself freely," she replied, her voice carrying farther than it should have in the still air. "As is my right under the ancient laws my blood helped establish." A murmur ran through the council at her words. Clearly they had expected either defiance or submission, not the confident assertion of legal standing. Lady Valdris tilted her head slightly, studying Elsbeth with eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of ages. "You claim knowledge of the old covenants," the council leader said. "Yet you have lived as a mortal, ignorant of your true nature, until awakened by Lord Lucien's presence. How do you justify rights you did not know you possessed?" "Ignorance imposed by necessity does not void inherited obligations," Elsbeth replied, drawing on knowledge that seemed to flow through her bloodline connection. "The pact your ancestors signed with mine contained provisions for dormant generations, recognition that power might sleep until circumstance demanded its awakening." Father Marcus stepped forward, opening the ancient satchel with reverent care. "If the council requires proof of legitimacy," he said, his voice carrying the formal cadence of someone schooled in supernatural law, "I present the original covenant, signed in Morgana's blood and sealed with Aurelius's power." The scroll emerged from the satchel with a sound like wind chimes, its silver surface reflecting light that had no earthly source. The reaction from the council was immediate. Several members stepped back involuntarily, while others leaned forward with expressions of wonder and concern. Even Lady Valdris seemed momentarily shaken by the appearance of a document most had believed destroyed centuries ago. "Impossible," whispered one of the council members, a warrior lord whose scarred face spoke of battles fought across continents. "The original pact was lost when Aurelius fell in the Shadow Wars." "Hidden," corrected Father Marcus, his academic training evident in the precision of his words. "Entrusted to mortal guardians against the day it might be needed again. The Church has served as custodian not from religious duty, but from recognition that some treaties transcend the boundaries between sacred and supernatural." Lady Valdris approached the scroll with careful steps, her ancient eyes scanning text that shifted and flowed even as she read it. When she looked up again, her expression had changed from judicial authority to something approaching genuine respect. "The bloodline claim is valid," she announced to her council. "The awakening, while unusual in its circumstances, falls within established precedent. The question before us is not legitimacy, but wisdom." "Wisdom?" Elsbeth asked, though through the pendant's connection she could sense Lucien drawing closer, his presence a steady comfort against the overwhelming power arrayed before her. "The decision to honor this bond, to grant you equal status within our hierarchy, and recognize your pairing with Lord Lucien as politically valid, will reshape centuries of careful balance," Lady Valdres explained. "It will signal to every supernatural court from here to the distant capitals that the age of separation is ending, that mortal and immortal realms are moving toward integration once again." "Some courts will see this as opportunity," added another council member, her voice carrying the musical tones that marked the diplomat caste. "Others will view it as threat to established order. Wars have been fought over lesser provocations." "And yet," came Lucien's voice from the darkness beyond the circle, "the alternative is stagnation that leads inevitably to decay. Our courts grow more isolated each century, more removed from the world they were created to protect." He stepped into the light, moving with the controlled grace that marked him as a master of supernatural combat. But it was not his physical presence that commanded attention. It was the way power seemed to flow between him and Elsbeth, creating a connection visible even to mortal eyes. "Lord Lucien," Lady Valdres acknowledged formally, "you risk much by pursuing this bond. Your standing in the courts, your inherited territories, even your existence, all could be forfeit if this gamble fails. And all will be meaningless if we continue down our current path," he replied without hesitation. "Elsbeth represents more than personal desire. She embodies the bridge our people need to remain relevant in a changing world." The council leader studied them both for a long moment, her ancient mind clearly weighing factors beyond mortal comprehension. Around them, the night air thrummed with supernatural tension as beings of immense power considered decisions that would echo through centuries. "Very well," Lady Valdres said finally. "The council will hear formal arguments. You have until dawn to present your case, to convince us that this bond serves not just personal desire, but the greater good of all our peoples." A circle of pale fire sprang up around the assembled figures, creating a formal court space that existed partially outside normal reality. Within its bounds, time moved differently, and truth became visible to those with eyes to see it. This was vampire justice, at its most ancient and powerful, judgment rendered not through argument alone, but through the fundamental forces that governed supernatural existence. Elsbeth felt the weight of ages pressing down upon her as she took her place within the circle. Around her, immortal beings who had shaped the hidden history of the world prepared to judge whether her love for Lucien was worth the chaos it might unleash. But as the formal proceedings began, she realized that the true test would not be convincing the council of her worthiness. It would be proving that love itself, in all its mortal complications and immortal possibilities, remained a force powerful enough to reshape even the most ancient of orders. The pendant at her throat blazed like a captured star, and in its light she saw reflected the faces of beings who had forgotten what it meant to hope for something beyond mere survival. Tonight, she would remind them. The formal hearing began with rituals older than written language, words of power that resonated through dimensions beyond the merely physical. But at its heart lay a simple question that had challenged philosophers and lovers throughout history: whether the bonds between individuals could transcend the boundaries that divided entire worlds. As dawn approached and the arguments reached their crescendo, Elsbeth understood that her answer, whatever it might be, would echo through centuries yet to come. The formal hearing erupted into chaos when the phoenix flame chalice appeared at the center of the circle. The ancient vessel materialized with a sound like breaking crystal, its golden surface inscribed with symbols that predated civilization itself. Sacred fire blazed within its depths, not the warm orange of earthly flames, but something pure and white that spoke of renewal through destruction. According to vampire lore, the chalice's appearance signaled that the gods themselves had taken interest in these proceedings. Lady Valdris stepped back from the artifact with something approaching awe. "The Phoenix Court intervenes," she murmured, her ancient voice carrying notes of surprise that suggested even she hadn't expected such divine attention. "The transformation ritual will proceed under sacred auspices." But before anyone could react to this pronouncement, the attack came. They struck from 3 directions simultaneously, rival vampire factions who had been watching from the forest shadows, waiting for the moment when the council's attention was focused on the chalice. These were not Seraphim's hunters, but something far more dangerous. Ancient vampires who viewed any change to established order as existential threat. The leader was a creature so old his name had become legend. Malphus the Destroyer, whose very presence seemed to drain light from the air around him. He had opposed the original pact between Morgana and Aurelius, and his hatred for bloodline unions had only deepened across the centuries. "The Phoenix Court has no jurisdiction here," he snarled, his voice carrying the authority of one who had destroyed civilizations. "This abomination will not be permitted to poison our realm with mortal weakness." The battle that followed was unlike anything Elsbeth could have imagined. Supernatural forces clashed with reality-bending intensity, turning the quiet clearing around her cottage into a battlefield that existed across multiple dimensions. The formal circle of pale fire became a prison of blazing energy, trapping defenders and attackers alike within its bounds. Lady Valdris moved with fluid grace that belied her ancient appearance, wielding power that reshaped the very air around her. But even she struggled against Malphus and his allies, vampires whose combined age measured in millennia, whose mastery of supernatural combat had been honed across countless wars. Lucien fought beside the council members with desperate intensity, the thornwood staff spinning patterns of light and shadow that held back creatures whose claws could tear through steel. But Elsbeth could sense through their bond that he was overmatched. These were not mere hunters, but the vampire equivalent of generals, beings who had commanded supernatural armies across continents. In the center of the maelstrom, the Phoenix Flame Chalice blazed with increasing intensity. Its sacred fire seemed to feed on the conflict around it, growing brighter and more demanding as supernatural forces clashed in its presence. Through the pendant at her throat, Elsbeth felt the chalice calling to her, not as supplicant, but as participant in whatever ritual it represented. The knowledge came through her bloodline connection, like inherited memory suddenly restored. The Phoenix Flame Chalice was more than just a ceremonial vessel. It was a catalyst for transformation that transcended normal vampire bonding. Its appearance meant that her union with Lucien could create something entirely new, a hybrid being who carried the best aspects of both mortal and immortal nature. But the ritual required completion during combat, the sacred fire fed by the very conflicts that threatened to destroy them all. "The chalice!" she shouted to Lucien across the battlefield. "It needs blood freely given, power willingly shared." He understood immediately, breaking away from his opponents to fight his way toward her. Around them, the battle raged with increasing intensity as ancient vampires realized what the Phoenix Court intended, Malthus himself turned his attention toward stopping the ritual, his presence bringing winter cold that made frost form on the sacred flames. Elsbeth reached the chalice first, her mortal form somehow able to pass through supernatural barriers that stopped even the council members. The vessel's heat was overwhelming, not painful, but transformative in ways that went beyond physical sensation. As her fingers closed around its stem, power flooded through her with the force of a breaking dam. The awakened bloodline heritage that had been gradually emerging suddenly blazed to full potential. Light erupted from her skin, carrying symbols and patterns that spoke of the original pact between human and vampire realms. Around her, the attacking vampires recoiled with hisses of pain and surprise. They had expected to face a newly awakened mortal, not the full manifestation of ancient bloodline power. Lucien reached her side, his pale eyes reflecting the sacred fire as he placed his hands beside hers on the chalice. The moment their skin touched, the battlefield seemed to freeze in place. Even Malthus paused in his assault, sensing that whatever happened next would reshape the fundamental nature of supernatural existence. "Together," Elsbeth whispered, and Lucien nodded his understanding. They lifted the phoenix flame chalice between them, its sacred fire blazing higher as their combined power fed the ritual. Around them, reality itself seemed to bend and flow, responding to forces that had been sleeping since the world was young. The transformation began with light, not the gentle silver glow of the pendant, but something fierce and primal that spoke of creation through willing sacrifice. As the sacred flames touched them both, Elsbeth felt her mortal nature expanding rather than being replaced, growing to encompass immortal possibilities without losing essential humanity. The ritual was incomplete, the battle far from over, but something fundamental had shifted in the balance of power. The Phoenix Court had spoken, and neither vampire politics nor ancient hatred could stand against divine will freely accepted. The Unity Stone blazed into existence at the moment Elsbeth and Lucien's transformation reached its crescendo, materializing from the phoenix flame chalice like a crystallization of pure possibility. The gemstone was unlike anything that existed in either mortal or supernatural realms, a fusion of elements that should have been incompatible, pulsing with energy that spoke of barriers broken and new realities forged. As the stone settled into Elsbeth's palm, she felt the final barriers between her mortal nature and immortal potential dissolve completely. But unlike traditional vampire transformation, which replaced human essence with supernatural power, the Unity Stone preserved and enhanced what she had always been. Her compassion became a force that could heal wounds across species. Her wisdom grew to encompass knowledge that spanned centuries. Her strength multiplied while retaining the gentleness that had defined her healing work. Beside her, Lucien underwent his own transformation, not gaining new power, but recovering aspects of himself that had been lost across 8 centuries of isolation. Through their bond, Elsbeth's humanity restored his capacity for growth, for change, for the kind of hope that had been slowly dying within him since his early centuries of existence. The effect on the battlefield was immediate and profound. Malthus, witnessing the successful completion of the ritual, let out a roar of fury that shattered trees and sent shockwaves through the supernatural dimensions. "Abomination!" he snarled, gathering power for what would clearly be a devastating final assault. "The pure bloodlines will not be corrupted by mortal sentiment." But before he could strike, Lady Valdris moved with authority that transcended mere physical action. The crown of shadows blazed from her brow as she stepped between the ancient destroyer and the newly transformed pair, her voice carrying the weight of absolute supernatural law. "The Phoenix Court has spoken through sacred ritual," she declared, her words resonating across dimensions. "To strike against those blessed by divine fire is to declare war against the cosmic order itself." The other attacking vampires hesitated, clearly recognizing that the situation had moved beyond simple political disagreement into realms where even they feared to tread. But Malphus was too consumed by centuries of hatred to heed such warnings. He struck with power that could have leveled mountains, supernatural force focused into an attack designed to obliterate both Elsbeth and Lucien before their transformation could stabilize. The energy that erupted from his assault was visible even to mortal eyes, a column of darkness that sought to devour light itself. It never reached them. The Unity Stone pulsed, and around Elsbeth and Lucien sprang a barrier unlike any seen in vampire courts for millennia. It was not mere supernatural defense, but something that drew strength from both mortal determination and immortal power. The attacking force struck the barrier and simply stopped. Not reflected or absorbed, but transformed into something beneficial, healing energy that restored the battle-damaged clearing to pristine condition. "Impossible," whispered one of Malphus's allies, stepping back from the display of power that redefined their understanding of what vampire abilities could accomplish. But Elsbeth was no longer simply defending. The Unity Stone had awakened capabilities that went far beyond traditional vampire magic. With her enhanced compassion now backed by immortal power, she could sense the pain that drove Malphus's hatred. Centuries of watching the supernatural world grow smaller and more isolated. Fear that change would mean extinction for everything he had helped build. "You're afraid," she said, her voice carrying across the battlefield with supernatural clarity. "Afraid that acknowledging our bond means admitting that your people need mortal connection to survive and grow." "I fear nothing from mortal weakness," Malphus snarled, but uncertainty flickered in his ancient eyes. "Not weakness," Elsbeth replied, stepping forward with confidence that came from newly awakened power. "Strength. The kind of strength that comes from choosing growth over stagnation, hope over fear, love over the safety of isolation." Around them, the other vampires, council members and attackers alike, watched with fascination as she demonstrated abilities that transcended traditional magic. Where she walked, the battle-scarred earth bloomed with flowers that could survive winter cold. Where her enhanced power touched wounded combatants, injuries healed regardless of which side they fought for. "This is what the Unity offers," she continued, gesturing to encompass both the restored clearing and the supernatural beings who had ceased fighting to witness something unprecedented. Not the replacement of one nature with another, but the creation of something entirely new, a bridge between worlds that strengthens both sides. Lucien moved to stand beside her, his own transformation now complete. The isolation that had defined his centuries of existence had been replaced by connection that enhanced rather than diminished his supernatural abilities. Together, they represented something that had never existed before. True partnership between mortal wisdom and immortal power. Lady Valdris studied them both for a long moment, her ancient mind clearly processing implications that would reshape vampire society for centuries to come. Then, with ceremonial gravity, she removed the crown of shadows from her own brow and offered it to them jointly. "The old order ends tonight," she announced to the assembled supernatural beings. "In its place, we establish new governance, rule by those who understand both worlds and can guide our people toward growth rather than mere survival. Malthus stood alone now, his allies having withdrawn their support as they witnessed the transformation of vampire politics happening before their eyes. His hatred remained, but it was the hatred of one who had lost not just a battle, but an entire worldview. The Unity Stone pulsed with warm light, and in its glow, Elsbeth saw the future that she and Lucien would build together, a world where mortal and immortal realms could flourish in partnership rather than fearful separation. 6 months later, the morning sun filtered through newly installed stained glass windows in what had once been Elsbeth's modest cottage. The structure itself had grown, not through conventional construction, but through the same supernatural forces that had transformed its inhabitants. Rooms flowed into one another with organic grace, creating spaces that could accommodate both intimate gatherings and formal councils between mortal and immortal representatives. At the heart of it all, the new covenant hung framed in silver and starlight, not merely a document, but a living agreement that pulsed with gentle energy as it recorded the ongoing evolution of supernatural politics. The artifact had written itself during the months following the Unity Stone's awakening, its text shifting and growing as new precedents were established and fresh challenges overcome. Elsbeth stood at her kitchen window, watching as Timothy's youngest daughter played in the garden with 2 creatures that would have terrified the village 6 months earlier. The bat Pups, no longer pups, but graceful adolescents whose intelligence grew daily, had become beloved members of the expanded household. They helped with healing work that now encompassed both human ailments and supernatural injuries, their keen senses able to detect illnesses that escaped even enhanced perception. "The delegation from the northern courts arrives this afternoon," Lucien said, entering the kitchen with the same fluid grace that had marked him as clearly inhuman during their first meeting. But now that supernatural elegance was tempered with something entirely mortal, contentment that came from belonging somewhere, with someone, in ways that transcended mere political alliance. "And the village council?" Elsbeth asked, though she already knew the answer through their bond. The transformation had not just united them personally, but created a connection that allowed them to share knowledge, emotion, and purpose with unprecedented intimacy. "Father Marcus has convinced them to attend," Lucien confirmed, settling beside her at the window. "Though Henrik still crosses himself whenever my name is mentioned." Elsbeth smiled at that. The Cooper's transformation from fearful opponent to grudging ally had been one of the more amusing developments of recent months. His arthritis, which her mortal healing skills had only been able to ease, had vanished entirely after she'd treated him with enhanced supernatural abilities. Practical benefits had overcome theological objections more effectively than any argument about peaceful coexistence. The village itself had adapted to its new circumstances, with the pragmatic flexibility that marked small communities facing change. Children who had once been warned away from the forest now played freely among trees that were patrolled by supernatural guardians. Women who had whispered fearfully about dark magic now brought their most serious ailments to a healer whose abilities transcended anything they had previously imagined possible. Not all the changes had been easy. Mrs. Aldrich had departed for her sister's village, unable to accept a world where the boundaries between sacred and supernatural had become permeable. Several other families had followed, seeking communities where the old certainties remained intact. But for every departure, new arrivals had taken their place. Scholars seeking to study the unprecedented union, healers hoping to learn enhanced techniques, diplomats from supernatural courts establishing permanent embassies in what had become neutral territory. Margaret knocked softly before entering, carrying fresh bread and the day's correspondence that had arrived through both mortal and supernatural postal systems. Her acceptance of the changes had been complete and immediate, partly because her own latent magical heritage had awakened in response to the elevated supernatural energy, but mostly because she had always possessed the wisdom to recognize genuine happiness when she saw it. 3 more requests for mediation, she announced, sorting through letters that bore seals from courts Elsbeth was still learning to identify. A territorial dispute between the Eastern Covens and the River Folk, a trade disagreement that's been simmering for 2 centuries, and something involving dragon inheritance rights that I don't pretend to understand. The work was challenging, but deeply satisfying. Elsbeth's enhanced abilities allowed her to perceive the emotional undercurrents that drove supernatural conflicts, while Lucien's centuries of experience provided historical context that revealed patterns invisible to shorter-lived perspectives. Together, they had begun resolving disputes that had seemed intractable to traditional vampire courts or mortal authorities. The trade disagreement first, Elsbeth decided, her enhanced intuition suggesting which case held the greatest potential for beneficial precedent. If we can establish economic cooperation protocols, it will create foundations for broader political alliance. Through the window, she could see Father Marcus approaching along the path that had once led only to her cottage, but now served as an unofficial diplomatic highway between realms. The priest's role had evolved as dramatically as everyone else's, from village spiritual leader to supernatural liaison, helping other religious authorities understand that divine will could work through vampire magic as easily as through more traditional miracles. The evening ceremony, Lucien asked, referring to the formal renewal of their bond that marked each full moon. The ritual was not necessary for maintaining their transformation, but it had become a celebration that brought together all the communities they served. Agnes is providing music, Elsbeth said, smiling as she remembered the elderly widow's surprising talent for songs that bridged mortal folk traditions with supernatural harmonies. Timothy's children are preparing the ceremonial flowers, and Lady Valdris promised to attend despite the travel required from the capital courts. As afternoon deepened toward evening, their expanded home filled with beings from across the spectrum of existence. Vampire nobles shared table space with village farmers, supernatural scholars debated arcane points with mortal philosophers, and children from a dozen different species played games that would have been impossible before the Unity Stone had rewritten the rules of interaction between worlds. The bat creatures, now grown large enough to carry small passengers, provided aerial entertainment that delighted mortal children while serving as living symbols of successful cooperation between radically different natures. Their presence reminded everyone that the most profound transformations often began with simple acts of compassion toward those who needed care. Standing before the assembled crowd as the full moon rose over Thornwick, Elsbeth reflected on how completely her quiet life of healing had been transformed. She had gained immortality, supernatural power, and influence that spanned continents. But perhaps more importantly, she had discovered that love, freely chosen and courageously maintained, could indeed change the world in ways that no amount of magical force could accomplish alone. The Unity Stone pulsed warm against her heart as Lucien took her hand, and together they spoke their words that renewed not just their personal bond, but their commitment to building bridges between worlds that had been separate for far too long. In the crowd before them, mortal and immortal faces reflected the same hope that had guided her choice to save 2 small creatures from winter cold, the belief that compassion, given freely, could create possibilities that transcended the boundaries of what any single world could achieve alone.